I wanted to put this talk together called, it sounded good on paper, to kind of walk through some of the lessons that we went through and learned when we started our journey on Puppet. When we first got started, we really didn't have any Puppet experience in-house at all, and we weren't really part of the community. So we did what most people do. We got clever, made a lot of dumb mistakes, had to refactor, and then made some more mistakes. And it's sort of like this iterative process that we kind of keep going through. So what we wanted to do was kind of put together some slides on what are the lessons that we learned, hopefully share those with you. So if you guys are early in your Puppet journey, you can skip some of the dumb mistakes that we've already made and deliver value quickly. I'm just a regular guy. I'm not one of these like super geniuses out here. So like these are all real practical tips that are going to be probably applicable immediately. So a little bit about myself first. My name is Jeff Smith. I'm the manager of the site reliability engineering team at Grubhub. Yes, we are hiring. I'm sure you're tired of hearing that today. Yes, there is free food. So if you're interested in joining a team solving cool problems and don't mind putting on 5 pounds, drop me a note. My contact information's there, jsmith@grubhub.com, and Dark and Nerdy on Twitter, which I'm sure I've seen some of you out in the Twitter sphere already. So I kind of wanted to walk through this sort of Puppet timeline that I feel like a lot of new Puppet users kind of go through. And some of it's exciting and some of it's really, really sad. First, you discover Puppet, right? You hear about it, you've got all these custom shell scripts that you've been working on, and you find out about Puppet and you're like, oh wow, this thing is pretty cool, right? This is gonna save a lot of energy. Then you get your first manifest created and now you're high, right? You're like, this is great. I just built my WordPress installation with this manifest. This is going to be amazing. Then you get your first rollout to production, and it's incredible, right? You're like, where has this been my entire life? But then you kind of start to head downhill a little bit, right? You discover your first edge case, and in reality, your edge case is probably just a really, really bad decision that you made earlier, but still, you're a little bummed about it, and you probably put in some horrible workaround that 2 years later, you're like, dear God, what was I thinking? Then after that, you get your request for your first prod-like environment. How many have had that one where it's like, oh yeah, we built it in production, let's build it in staging next, right? And then you say, oh my goodness, I made all of these terrible assumptions, right? I can't build this environment again because I'm reliant on host names being a particular thing. Then you get your first audit, and then it's just like tears and sorrow and crying. So then when we're kind of in that lull, we have our first chat with other Puppet users, and we kind of get excited again. We're like, all right, cool. So what we want to do is kind of help you navigate through this part and kind of keep you on the high end. How many people are part of a Puppet user group in their area? So if you're not in one, I would recommend you find your Puppet user group. If you don't have one, start your Puppet user group, because it's a tremendous resource in the community. So we had 10, 11, 12 tips for things that we did wrong. As we were as I was walking through in the conference, I was overhearing certain conversations, and I was like, oh, got to add that one because we made that mistake too. Oh, made that mistake, got to add that one too. So we're going to just walk through 12 terrible things that we did. First, though, we kind of want to talk about like what Puppet manages, right? Because there's a couple different configurations that people have used, right? You can do like the base system setup, right? Where all you're managing is like, your SSH configs, your HTTP configs, your package versions, user management, that's it, right? Then some people actually manage part of their applications, their specific applications, right? Your payroll app. They manage that in Puppet. So it's doing a lot of the dependencies for the application. And then some people are actually doing application deployments, where they're actually doing like the actual deployment of code, the orchestration of those deployments. They're doing that all in Puppet. I feel like in our journey, we kind of had a mixture of this, and we really wanted to kind of say, all right, we need to draw the line somewhere in terms of what Puppet manages and put the other pieces in the proper tools. So like one of the things that we first said is we kind of wanted to minimize how much app-specific configuration we're doing. So we have a lot of manifests. And it's predominantly because we have app-specific configuration in all of our roles, right? So we don't have things like Tomcat server, web server. We have very specific things like payroll server, payroll database server. And it just drives up the number of app-specific configs that we have, the number of roles explodes, and it becomes a little difficult for us to manage. We also noticed that it slowed down developers a lot. Because we manage this application-specific configuration in Puppet, in our environment, the developers don't currently have access to Puppet because of some other horrible mistakes we made, which we'll talk about. But because they don't have access to Puppet, any change that they need to make has to come through the systems team. Well, guess what? It's a small change, right? We're just changing this one config property. But anyone that works in a ticketing system knows it's not how long the work takes, it's how long the work sits in the queue before someone can actually get to it. So the entire time that that ticket is sitting in a queue, that's waste for the developer. And the other problem that we ran into is it pushes the deployment responsibilities into configuration management. And what I mean by that is, so often that we skip the packaging portion of our application, right? We don't create packaging around these things. Who's had the 10-page install doc for how to actually deploy a service, right? That's terrible. It's terrible because we have all of these tools at our disposal that'll package the application and handle this stuff for us. And we think, well, it's in production, so if Puppet's managing that, it's not a big deal. Well, the minute a developer wants to install it on his local machine, right, it blows up. Why? Because the packaging system doesn't exist. So it doesn't create any of the dependencies. I mean, things like folder structures, right? Like, could you imagine if you installed Apache and first you had to create Etsy HTTPD and then you had to create user local Apache? Like, it's insane. But for some reason in our organizations, we accept that. And Puppet can kind of be an enabler if you don't push that down into the right locations of the deployment process. So deployment process should handle deployment type tasks, and your roles should be, well, in our experience, the more generic your roles are, the better it is for you. So you have a Tomcat server role, you have a web server role. It's just so much easier to manage. Tip number 2, code-based structure matters. When we first implemented Puppet, we were doing a lot in our modules, a lot. So like if we had a role for, let's say, our consumer site, that role didn't make any assumptions about its underlying environment. So that manifest was installing Apache, it was doing its SSH configs, it was doing anything and everything that this app needed to go into production. So when we attached a class to it, to the node, the class was literally consumer site and it would handle everything. But that became problematic, mainly because it's difficult when you want to make a change and you want to know like how many modules are going to be impacted by this. You kind of have to go spelunking, right? There's no one place that you can look like in the modules, profiles, roles pattern where you can just look and say, all right, who's taking this on as a dependency? It could be included like 3 layers deep and you're completely unaware of it. So when you finally do make the change, run Puppet, there's these other modules that are blowing up that you weren't even aware of. So the approach that we took was that it was okay for our modules to make assumptions about the environment that they were in. And it led to cleaner code, and it led to easier management of all of our modules. So if your app needs to set up a vhost file, right? Your module for that, your profile for that can assume that Apache has already been installed. And that will be handled at some higher level of the organization or of the abstraction. And that's where modules, profiles, and roles patterns comes into play. How many are using modules, profiles, and roles? How many are sick of hearing that you should be using modules, profiles, and roles? Yeah, I figured. You should be using modules, profiles, and roles. It's made such a tremendous difference in how we structure our code. And just for those that don't know, I'm sure you've been beat over the head, but for those that don't know, modules, profiles, and roles is basically an organization pattern where you break up your modules into 3 different categories, right? You have your manifests that are modules, which handle the underlying plumbing, right? So it's the Tomcat module, and it doesn't imply any business logic. It's just explicitly saying, like, I am the module that manages and can configure Tomcat for you. Then you have a profile where you add your actual business-specific logic, right? And then you have a role, which is a collection of your profiles to deliver that Tomcat web server as your organization defines it. The other thing in terms of code base structure is a single code base regardless of the environments that you have. So we had 2 different teams. We had the production support team, and then we had the release engineering team. The release engineering team was responsible for managing QA environments. Production was responsible for, the systems team was responsible for managing the production environments. And since you want QA to look exactly like production, it makes perfect sense that we have 2 separate code bases for it, right? No, it's a nightmare, right? We kind of had this just artificial, like, separate set of responsibilities. Well, you guys do QA, so you manage it your way. We do prod, we manage it our way. But that's ridiculous because we want those environments to be the same. So if you're in a situation where you feel like you can't manage your testing environments with the same code as your production environments, chances are you've made a mistake somewhere and you need to reevaluate that. And it's actually very serious and you should address it as soon as possible. Tip number 3, everyone is watching. Yeah, this one was sad. Passwords in your repo, unencrypted. Yeah, we cry about that a lot over beer. Will an auditor throw up in their mouth when they see your code base? Probably, right? The minute you see that, you're like, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. And that sense of shame you feel when you make that commit, yeah, that's a problem. You know it's a problem. That's why you feel shame, right? You do it anyways. You throw a cute comment in there and you're just like, dear God, I'm so sorry for this, but I'm committing it anyways, because I just ain't got time for that shit, right? But think about that. Think that everyone is watching, right? That commit is going to mean something to someone, and while future you is going to laugh when he reads that comment, he's still going to hate you, right? He's still going to hate you. A repo per module. How many people are doing a repo per module? Yeah, and everyone else, I guess you just have the big monolithic app. How many poor bastards are still on SVN? Subversion, yeah. I'm sorry. I'll buy you a drink afterwards. We'll talk about it. I had the same problem. So we have a single monolithic repository for everything. And we had a point where we had an opportunity to change that, but we didn't quite understand the pain that we were in, mainly because we were using SVN. So not only were we refactoring all our code, we were also moving to Stash. A lot of people hadn't worked with Git, so they weren't really familiar with the paradigms, the branching strategy, and how important that was going to be. So at that point, we still decided we're going to do a single repo. Now, everyone says that you should do a repo per module, but they never really explain what happens when you don't, right? First of all, your timeline gets completely polluted, right? I mean, there's just all types of terrible, like, you really start to judge some of your coworkers when you see the list of commits, right? You're just like, oh God, you forgot another semicolon. Oh God, curly braces, come on, do it again. Use a linter, for God's sakes. But the timeline just continues to get polluted, more and more junk, right? So when you're looking for that one change that you want to roll back, right, you might have to go 20, 30 commits back. It's terrible. And then your changes also kind of become intermingled in a way that's not optimal. Automated testing is probably the biggest pain point that we find, though, because with this huge repo, we have no clean way of identifying which tests that we need to run when the commit happens. Sure, we can look at the commit log and then figure out which manifests change and then try to figure out through the dependency chain like what modules are impacted by that and run those specific tests. But that's terrible. And you're probably going to get it wrong. And you're going to get it wrong when? At 2 a.m., right? When your pager goes off, you got to make a quick fix and you blow everything up. The other problem is that you can't just run all of the tests in your environment, right? Like, is anyone doing automated testing now, their Puppet code? How long are your tests running? If you ran everything. Okay, so like if we ran everything, our Puppet code base, the test would run like 35, 40 minutes, right? So our barometer is like, if something were broken at 2 a.m. and we needed to push a patch out, are we okay waiting 40 minutes for that change to roll out? So, you know, go back and ask your manager that, like, hey boss, is it cool? I mean, we'll know it's safe at that point, maybe, but 40 minutes, is that cool? Probably not. So those are some of the major pain points. The other major point is we can't version any of our modules because it's all in one big repo. So an example is like ActiveMQ is sort of at the epicenter of our application stack, right? So if we make a change to the ActiveMQ module, it would be nice if we could version that so that as we roll it out to various environments, we can just, you know, change the version dependency and kind of take that risk on incrementally. Instead, we end up doing it on a branch. We test in one environment, and then we merge it to the main testing branch, and then all of the test environments break at the same time. It would be nice if we could somehow, pin that to a particular version and ensure that, we could roll this out slowly but surely. Doesn't work in a single repo, so that's another bummer. And sort of speaking of testing, when we first heard about RSpec Puppet and all these other, test suites, we kind of got crazy, and we were like, yes. Let me rephrase that. I got kind of crazy, and I was like, oh yes, I can test everything. But then it occurred to us that a lot of times we're really just testing Puppet, right? Like that Puppet is doing what Puppet is supposed to do, right? What is the point in verifying that a file exists? That's what you got Puppet for. If you need to test that, then what are we doing here? So we had to start getting very specific about the types of things that we were testing. And the break-off now is pretty much like, are we doing something clever, right? Like, is there some sort of conditional logic? Is there some regex expression that's being done? And we test those very specific things. We're eventually going to get to server spec where we're actually testing the finished node at the end, but we're not there yet. So making sure that what we're testing is actually valuable has been a big thing. And again, keeping your tests fast. Oh, this one, never hand touch a server. So how many are familiar with this sort of process, right? When people are getting new to the Puppet, they're like, oh, I'm not really sure. It'll be faster if I just figure it out how to do it, and then I'll write the Puppet manifest later. That never works out right? That never works, because what ends up happening is there's that one change that you forgot about, that you didn't document, and then when you go to run Puppet on a brand new server, it doesn't work. So that loop is kind of a fallacy. And it's even worse because like what you'll do is you'll build the manifest after you've built the server, and then you'll run Puppet against that box and say, all right, what's changed? Oh, yay, nothing's changed. But you forget that Puppet is declarative, right? And if you didn't declare it, then it's not even going to try to enforce it, right? So that package that you installed quietly and secretly, it's already there. So yeah, of course that's not going to come up. So that's problematic. So we always say, never hand touch a server. A server is not done until you can bring it up, run Puppet, and not have to do a single thing until it's, you don't have to do a single thing to have it configured the way you want it to be configured. We always try to build the server from scratch. Even a single change is off limits. Whoops. Tip number 6, this one we learned the hard way too. There are only 3 numbers, 0, 1, and many. So we used to make a lot of assumptions in our code about what the infrastructure looked like, right? Oh, there's only one of these. So as we design the module, we only account for this one instance, right? Or there's only going to be 2 of these. So when we design the module, we say like, oh, this is an A and this is a B. And the minute you add a C node, the world blows up. So even though it takes a little bit more effort, it might take a little bit more code, you should always, always, always assume that there could be multiple of this thing. And not just 2, 3, 4, 8, right? So always think in terms of 0, 1, or many, because you just never know. And the minute you assume that, you're guilty of hubris, and you're going to be wrong. Plus, if you only think there's 2 of a thing, you know that there's someone in a back room somewhere planning the 3rd one, and then you're screwed. Exported resources are evil. How many people are using exported resources? How many people are happy with their exported resources? Yeah, that's kind of where we are too. So we've had sort of mixed results with exported resources. We find that a lot of times though, once we got more mature with Puppet, we realized that our usage of exported resources could probably be solved a different way. So the biggest place where we use exported resources is for Tomcat nodes to kind of express to the world, hey, these are the AJP ports that I'm listening on, right? So that we can have the Apache layer then later collect those resources, build its worker.properties file, and communicate with those nodes. In a way though, that's sort of like service discovery, right? So the question is, are we solving the problem with the right tool? Can we move that somewhere else? The other problem that we run into with exported resources is they age out. And I didn't realize that at first when we first started playing with it. So what would happen is, we'd be doing some work on ActiveMQ. We would disable Puppet for a while we figured things out. 14 days later, those resources are gone. When the collection process happens, all of the configuration is missing. Someone comes and restarts the service, and then boom, we're down. And it's like, oh, whoops. So luckily, it's only happened in tests, never in production. But that's another gotcha with exported resources. If you have to use exported resources, though, one thing that we found is extremely useful is if you come up with clear documented ways on how you're going to tag all of your exported resources so that you can collect them in various fashions. So one of the common patterns that we use is we have a standard name for the type of resources that we're exporting, and then we'll tag them with a general tag. If someone wants all of those exported resources, then we'll tag them with an environment-specific tag, because we may have 12 different separate environments managed by Puppet. So when we want to collect resources for the Zoidberg integration environment, we only want Zoidberg to get Zoidberg's resources. So by tagging it with this sort of factor fact, it makes it a lot easier to collect. Tip 8, branching strategies. We're still trying to figure this one out. So in our environment, we have two main branches that we work off. We have the develop branch and the master branch. Development is for test. We actually have a separate Puppet master that sources from the develop branch. And all of our integration and test environments are linked to that guy. Then we have a production server, and the production has a master branch, and all of our nodes are linked in production to that production Puppet master. So as we do our testing, we'll build a manifest, make changes, whatever, commit, it'll run through automated testing, it'll deploy to the test production server. Then once that's good, we'll do a pull request, merge it in the master, and that'll get pushed out. The problem that we ran into, though, is that everything in test is off the develop branch. And everyone knows that, like, one man's test is another man's production, right? So you can't really break those environments, because once you do, you have 60 developers screaming at you saying, like, hey, this thing doesn't work anymore. So we run into a few problems, and we haven't quite solved this one yet. But it's like, one, we need to periodically blow away the develop branch, right, and rebase master off of it, because sometimes there's drift, sometimes there's things that don't make it all the way there. Sometimes when people are working off a feature branch, they're rebasing, so when they merge, the commit looks different in master than it looks in develop. It gets kind of messy. And a bad change can break all of pre-prod, which sucks. We have merge conflicts that exist in develop that don't exist in prod, and vice versa. And the long-running question that we always have is, like, do you do pull requests for develop? We prefer not to, because it kind of slows you down. Right now, we have 2 pull requests approver is required for any merge to master. But do you want to do that in develop too? That kind of slows things down, but at the same time, it kind of gives that oversight. So that problem we haven't really solved yet. We have talked about potentially, like, having each environment have its own branch and kind of work off of that. But then we fear that we've just sort of federated that problem out to multiple branches. So I'd be really interested to hear how other people are kind of solving this problem in their test environments. Be realistic about your secrets. Oops. Looks like I skipped one, sorry. Be realistic. Branches, gotchas, alternatives. We talked about that. Be realistic about your secrets. So every time I come to a conference, I was at DevOps Days, there's always a conversation about secrets. And it's always sort of this, like, yeah, secrets management, we don't really do it that well, right? And every year it's the same story. And it's just like, guess what? Everybody sucks. It seems like everybody sucks at secrets management. So if there's anything you can take away from this conference, you can go home and be like, boss, guess what? Good news. We're not alone. Everybody else sucks too. But the idea is, like, people have these sort of Rube Goldberg devices to kind of figure out how to get their keys or their secrets in a place. But if all of that ends up in a plain text file, then you've lost already, right? You're already screwed. So be realistic about how secure you're actually being and what level of complexity you're adding just to protect that poor plain text file. How many people are using Huayra YAML? You got to be using Huayra YAML. It's awesome. How many of you guys are using JSON as your Huayra structure? Yeah. So we were using JSON first, and we had a lot of frankly bullshit conversations about like, well, JSON. You know, we like JSON because, well, we like JSON because we already had JSON, right? So we had a huge debate about that, and then finally said, screw it, we're going to get over it. We switched to Huayra YAML. Life is so much better. So definitely check out Huayra YAML if you haven't. There's actually a pretty nice Node.js package that will help you convert from YAML to JSON and vice versa. So that's huge as well. But being able to encrypt our secrets in Huayra is awesome because it's taking us one step further to be able to open up that code base to developers. So now more people can look at the Puppet code. Right now, we sort of got it locked down predominantly around the fact that there is all this horrible secret information that we said, well, it's okay that it's in there because only the SREs have access to it. That's usually not really a good reason or excuse, so Huayra YAML is helping us move away from that. But key distribution is still a little funky for us. Right now, we have finally moved key distribution. We finally moved secret keys out of the repositories. How many people have made that mistake before, too? Oh, come on. All right, one guy. Yeah. Keys in repositories suck, and it seems like it's a little more common than people admit to. So we've finally got those yanked out of the repository, and we use Puppet File Server to help us distribute the keys. So basically, what we do is we define a path in our file server config, whitelist the nodes that are allowed to access that, and then in our manifest, we use a source of Puppet//SSL keys. That gets them to the web servers. Because we separate test and production too, we only put the test keys in test and the production keys in production. So we don't have to worry about a node accidentally getting prod keys when it doesn't belong there. Actual distribution to the Puppet master is still currently manual, but we do store those in a secure vault that has an API, so we're going to be building something to kind of automatically get those to the Puppet masters. But, you know, for right now, it's not really that labor intensive to move keys around as we age them out. Tip number 10 is one that we're going through now. Build your monitoring into Puppet from day one. It doesn't make sense that provisioning a node and monitoring a node are two separate operations, right? They're two separate actions. Depending on your monitoring tool, I'm sure there's a Puppet module out there for it. And it's so much better if you just sort of build that right in from the beginning, right? Because what inevitably happens is you spin up a new node into production, and then you forget to add the monitoring right away. So you go a few hours with a box that you're completely blind to. If you build it in Puppet, as you provision it across the environments, you're getting that monitoring consistently from environment to environment, and you can see how the app behaves as you move through the deployment pipeline. Stop using exec. How many people have execs in their Puppet code base? How many people are happy with the way that performs? Yeah. We have a few exec statements in our code base that we're still trying to purge. One of the things that I think always bothers me about it is it sort of takes the elegance out of Puppet, right? Because the thing I like about Puppet is as I'm reading it, I have a pretty firm understanding of what's happening. But a lot of times when I see exec statements, there's some shell script that's being invoked. So I now have to punch out to another thing to figure out exactly how that works. And it might be Bash, it might be Perl, God help us, it might be Python. So it just kind of interrupts the reading of a manifest, right? The other thing is, you know, historically, I don't see people doing a good job of ensuring that exec statements only run when they need to. But a lot of people figure like, oh, well, as long as that operation is idempotent, who cares, right? Like it can run as many times as it needs to as long as it's producing the same output. Well, where we get bit with that is during the audit. So when we sell Puppet to people, one of the things we say is like, listen, and we have this awesome dashboard, thanks to Puppet Enterprise, that shows us all of our nodes and how often they're changing and when they're falling out of compliance, and we know immediately when this is happening. So you look, and you'll notice that if you have exec statements, they always trigger a change. So then you're looking at the auditor, and you're showing them this list, and you're like, yeah, this box changes on every run. So now you have to explain to them how exec works, and you're going to be trapped in some room reading pro code you wrote 2 years ago, trying to figure out where you went wrong in life. So we're trying to actively stop using exec. And last but not least, use Huayra. I talked to a few people here that weren't using Huayra, and I was like, oh my goodness, do you have any idea how much that could save you? Is everyone using Huayra? How many people are using Huayra? Okay, fair amount. We say case statements are usually a code smell, because typically anything that we had a case statement before, we replaced with Huayra. There are some valid use cases for it, but typically whenever we had a case statement in our code base, we realized that we should be doing this in Huayra. And Huayra is that magic bullet that allows you to use the same code for multi-environments, right? So if you are really putting your business logic and that configuration information into Huayra, you've got everything you need to make sure that you can build environments from dev to integration to production. Right now, we're building a Packer image for local developers, and we're using the exact same code base with a few minor changes to accommodate the local environment. And another interesting conversation I was having yesterday was, people are kind of afraid of the number of Huayra structures that they're going to have and how complex that may or may not get. It's worth it. It really is. So I have a slide that kind of walks through what our Huayra structure looks like today. So at the top level, we have our nodes, so the actual client cert. The second level is environment, and by environment, it's like, what application environment is this tied to? Is it production? Is it staging? Is it certification? Is it integration? Then we have a data center, and that's where a lot of our, like very specific configs for like maybe LDAP or what DNS servers, things like that. We keep that in the data center level. Then we have a performance profile. So we're a Java shop, so things like JVM settings, right? That might happen per app, but we may want different settings depending on the environment that we're in. One for local, one for integration, one for staging, one for prod. And then we have the default fallback of globals. Another mistake we made with Huayra, for the love of God, don't put numbers in your Huayra structure, right? Because we thought we were being neat by being able to quickly look and say, oh, this is going to get parsed first, this is going to get parsed second. Then you got to add one in the middle of something, and you have some dumb number like, oh, it's level 04-5, right? Don't worry about it. Huayra.conf explains what the hierarchy looks like, so it is an extra step, but it's worth it. And we're a little ahead of time, so I'll be able to get out of here and catch the Cubs. But yeah, those are our 12 tips. I'd love to chat with anyone that kind of experience similar things or how they solve problems. But my information's here if everyone's rushing to get out to see the Cubs like I am. But thanks for listening. And we have like 10 minutes for any questions too. Oh, one over here. It's okay, I won't hurt you if you're keeping me from the Cubs, it's fine.
Mike? A blocker. Sure. We've got some teams that are using like create resource structures in Huayra, including like requires and things like that, and it just looks bad to me. I don't know if you've encountered that at all.
Yeah, so we use create resources. He was saying that they have teams that use create resources, and they'll do a lookup in Huayra and then just do a bunch of resources at once. We use that pattern, not a lot, but like when there's a whole bunch of resources that we need to create, typically around like users or actually it's pretty much exclusively users now that I think about it. We will follow that pattern occasionally. It is a little weird, right? Because now you've got this sort of like structured JSON that's specific to this thing that's messy. But for the most part, it was a lot better than, having a bunch of resource statements. But I hear the latest version will have iteration, so that will hopefully help resolve that.
You mentioned that you have multiple Puppet masters. Is there anything specifically to having a multiple master environment that you learned or wish you had done differently?
The multiple master environment, it's largely an artifact of us being chicken shit. It was nice to have this separate environment that we could kind of, so one tip I should have put on here that I didn't. When we first started, there was this sort of not built here syndrome, right? So everything that we did, we didn't use anything on the forge. Everything was artisanally handcrafted because we're so much smarter than all you guys. There's no way you can compete with our code. So the separate puppet master was largely a defense mechanism against us screwing up. And then we sort of just carried the pattern forward. It still does work nicely, just because it does give you that completely separate environment where if you want to try something out, you can. But now with the advances in like Vagrant and being able to build local puppet masters on your workstation, we use, we're less cavalier because we can do a lot of that on our desktops. So it doesn't hurt, but it isn't helping as much as it used to. And it makes licensing a pain in the ass because now we have to figure out, like how many licenses do we have across multiple servers. Is that Blackhawks or Winterhawk?
Oh, it's Blackhawk.
All right. See, I never heard of the Winterhawks till I got here, and then I'm seeing that. I'm like, oh, there's like a Blackhawk farm team, but no.
No, I just had a quick comment in terms of Huayra. I'm a firm proponent of naming your directory structures in Huayra based off of the facts that you use to create your Huayra, to create your hierarchy. Do not mix individual levels at one level. So I see a lot of people create their hierarchy as data center and then environment, but when it comes to their Huayra data directory, they're all at the same level. I find that actually causes confusion.
Okay, repeat that for me one last time, sorry.
Okay, so when it comes to creating your Huayra data structure, the paths in the file system.
Right. Oh, okay. Yeah, so for us, if I understand what your comment correctly, for us, we have a separate environment, right? So it's / production, let's say, right? And then underneath that, so like for things like environment, where it's like cert 1, prod 1, at the next level, it is actually based on the class name. So we basically have a separate YAML file for each of the various classes at each level, except for the node level, because it's just the one. So for us, prior to that, we had everything at a particular level, which I think is what you're saying. So like, we would have globals, we would have a single file, and it would have every Huayra lookup that we had in the environment. That got a little messy. Merge conflicts were painful. So when we split that out to do it by class name, it exploded the number of files that we had, but it turned out to be a lot easier to manage. Where we did find problems, though, is as we started building our code base out, we found that we had the same pattern over and over again for certain types of apps. So we built a wrapper class that wrapped the actual implementation of Tomcat, but because of the variable scoping, we would lose the true class name as it was resolved. So it would never actually resolve correctly and find the correct Huayra data. So we had to come up with another janky hack where we basically passed an override to that class so it knew what to look up in Huayra.
So exactly how bad are the create resource calls? So I just wrote, I have several legacy servers with hundreds of custom URLs for clients. So they're running Apache information. When they need Apache information, they have separate web apps. So I wrote a wrapper for all that to just read in the Huayra data and create everything. It passes the same data to Apache for the host names and things like that. Passes the same data to the Tomcat build so that it creates, based on the context information, it builds the web app for you. So all that's just done through a create resource call that uses a very complex Huayra structure.
Yeah, it's a matter of preference, right? Like, I think where it loses points is probably in readability, and you also lose some of like the benefits of like linting, right? Because that's now a JSON document or a YAML document that might be valid YAML, but may not be valid when it gets instantiated as a Puppet resource. I mean, you can catch for that in other ways, but like for me, does anyone use Guard, Puppet Guard? Oh, let me tell you about Puppet Guard. So Puppet Guard is basically a Ruby gem that will watch a series of files and then execute commands as that file changes. So one of the things I do is I have it execute linting based on the file type. So every time I change a file, it detects that, oh, that's a Puppet file, you've changed it, I'm going to run the linter, and I'm going to tell you if it's good, bad, or indifferent. So I just have that constantly running in a window. So like you would lose that sort of functionality in a setup that you have. But I mean, it works as long as everyone knows where to look and they're comfortable with managing them at that location.
The advantage was I could use that same module now for the next legacy server that's running another 100 clients.
Yeah, and that's the terrible thing, right? Because like, everything's a trade-off, right? So, there's always pros and cons. I'll be back here next year telling you how I screwed up everything I just told you about we fixed. Thought I saw another one over here.
So the modules that you're using off of the Forge, how successful have you been in using them? How much change have you had to make to the things you pulled off the Forge to use them in your environment? And if you've had to make changes, how do you handle keeping up with what's out there or giving back to the public Forge?
So we have had tremendous success with the modules on the Puppet Forge, mainly because 5,000 developers are better than the 5 that we have. So what we found is that the modules that we wrote were very specific to our environment, and when that environment changed, the module had to be modified. Whereas with the modules from the Forge, those edge cases are kind of taken into account. It's much more generic. Sure, it may be a little more verbose than if something that you wrote because you know that this setting is always the same, so I'm going to make it a default. But it's much more flexible. We haven't had any issues with incompatibility, largely because we're not doing a separate repo per module. Our versioning is pretty much static. We'll see what happens when we upgrade to Puppet 4 and what that entails, but so far it's definitely been the best choice for us. So if you're not using modules from the Forge, I would highly, highly, highly recommend it. And don't let anybody give you that not built here crap. Anybody else? Felix, my man.
So a bit of a comment, total agreement on how exec is inconvenient, and especially the reporting and logging gets really ugly if everything is full of execs. But at this point, you're basically required to write your own types and providers, right? If you want to implement something that Puppet cannot do right now. So that is not as easy as it should be. Do you have any other strategies to tackle that, to avoid exec?
No, and that's exactly where we kind of fell with a lot of the exec statements that we have. We were able to, so there's 2 types of issues that I've seen, and not just in our shop, but in other shops, right? There's people that do exec because Puppet doesn't offer an alternative, and the people that do exec because they're better at Bash than they are at Puppet DSL, right? So the Bash excuse has to go. In terms of like, those things that Puppet doesn't offer, sometimes you do have to fall back to an exec, unfortunately. And while I had loved the idea of writing your own provider and type, you're right, it's not that easy. It is, pretty hardcore Ruby development, right? So for a lot of people, especially operations folks, they don't have a lot of programming experience. They've got their arms around the DSL, but once they, drop into pure Ruby, things get a little darker. So that's exactly why the 2 execs that we still have still exist. I would love to find, like, if anyone's using like any sort of like great online Ruby training, I would love to, you know, kind of federate that out to the team. So any suggestions, shoot me a tweet or something. Well, everybody have a safe trip home. Go Cubs.